For the 2022-23 lectureship, our speaker is Dr. Cole Jeffrey. His four-part series will address the aesthetics of sin, Calvinism, beauty, and depravity in early modern English literature. Dr. Jeffrey was born and raised in Denton, Texas, in a conservative homeschooling family. He received his PhD from the University of North Texas in 2017, and he is an assistant professor of English at Charleston Southern University. His research explores the relationship between Renaissance literature and Reformed theology. His article, Here is Beauty Changed to Ugly Whoredom, Calvinist Theology and Neoplatonic Aesthetics in the Changeling, was published in the spring 2019 edition of Renaissance Drama. He is currently writing a book about Calvinism's impact on writers like William Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, John Donne, George Herbert, and John Milton. The lectures he will deliver at NSA are based on this project. While Dr. Jeffrey is not teaching, or when Dr. Jeffrey is not teaching, researching, or writing, he loves spending time with his wife, Courtney, and his newborn son, Reed. He also loves watching classic movies, reading mystery novels, eating cheese, and traveling to new places. Well, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeffrey.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is so exciting to be here. This is an incredible community. It's a place where people read George Herbert poems, and every event here seems to be food-themed, so I know I'm in the right place. This is an incredible opportunity for me. I'm visiting with my wife, Courtney, our son, Reed, and we were so excited to be here. Many of you know Courtney. She graduated from NSA in 2015, went on to get her master's degree from here. And I don't think there's a day goes by where Courtney doesn't talk about NSA or Moscow and the rich community here and how formative that was in her spiritual and intellectual development. And I know all of you know this, but you are part of a unique community. And for this Disputatio, I'm excited to be part of that community and share with you. So what I'm going to be talking with you all about for the rest of the academic year is my book project, The Aesthetics of Sin, Beauty and Depravity in Early Modern English Literature. And this is based on my dissertation. It's based on current research. And the goal of this project, can everybody hear me okay? Am I on? We're good? Okay, all right, just want to make sure. Technology is usually not my friend, as I have found out. All right, but sometimes it works for me rather than against me. So the goal of this project is to demonstrate two things. First of all, it's to demonstrate Calvinism's impact on Renaissance literature. And this is actually, as I discovered, a fiercely controversial topic. Many people, especially in secular academia, tend to associate Calvinism with the Puritans. They tend to assume that Calvinism was anti-art, anti-aesthetics, and they assume that it had a marginal influence on Renaissance culture. But the reality is, during the reigns of Queen Elizabeth and King James, about 60, 70-year period, Calvinism is the dominant theology in the Church of England. And so I don't think you can explain English literary culture without explaining Calvinism's positive impact on that culture. The second goal of this project is to demonstrate how Renaissance literature shaped how people in the early modern period thought about beauty. Because during the 1500s and the 1600s, there's a radical shift in how people think about beauty. And so what I want to demonstrate is how Calvinism influences literature, literature in turn influences culture, and culture leads to this shift in how people think about beauty and ugliness and how we perceive these things. So when I'm talking with my students, most of my students are not familiar with aesthetics, so I like to jump in immediately and start with a big philosophical dilemma. Let's make sure this is working for me. It is, wonderful. All right, so I know I'm in a room full of scholars, some young, some old, some older than others, and I know that you wrestle with these kinds of issues. If you're like me, these issues kind of keep you up awake at night, and you probably wrestle with them. So I want to start with an aesthetic dilemma, and I want to get your take on this. So what do we think about this? Here's a deep philosophical question for you. Who is more handsome, Chris Hemsworth, aka Thor, the God of Thunder, or Benedict Cumberbatch? Show of hands, who thinks Chris Hemsworth, the God of Thunder, is more attractive? All right, okay, put your hands down. Okay, show of hands, who thinks Benedict Cumberbatch is more attractive? All right, it is a smaller group, and it's almost entirely female, all right? All right? This is interesting. This is very interesting to me. This is such a deeply pressing philosophical issue, y'all, that Saturday Night Live, the source of all wisdom in our culture, devoted a whole episode to why is Benedict Cumberbatch hot? Those of you who raised your hands, you have some explaining to do. By the man's own admission, he looks like an otter, all right? So we have to think about this. So when I'm trying to explain aesthetics to my students, I usually start off something with silly but insightful like this. And so I'll ask them, who's hotter, Chris Hemsworth, Benedict Cumberbatch? And inevitably what will happen is a big debate will break out because there will be a small minority of Cumberbatch fans, and they will vehemently argue that he is more attractive. And I will just sit there like a good professor does and let them argue for a while. And then I will interject myself into the conversation. I'll say, okay, it seems like we have very strong opinions about this. It's elicited this powerful response. How do we resolve this? How do we figure out who is objectively more attractive? Is there a way we can resolve this? And inevitably, my students will kind of shrink back from their arguments and their positions they've taken. They say, there's no way to resolve this. It's all in the eye of the beholder. It's all subjective. And I think that's fascinating to me because in that conversation, like I said, it's a silly example, but it illuminates a big problem that I think lies at the heart of aesthetics, because aesthetics is the branch of philosophy that deals with our experience of beauty and what beauty is, and do we perceive it and respond to it rightly. And so what I think this illuminates is that when we respond to beauty, we treat it as if it's this powerful force, something that pulls us outside of ourselves. But when we're pressured to talk about it, we resort to this idea that it's subjective, it's a matter of personal taste, and there's really no way to resolve these issues. And those threads, those epistemological dilemmas, are at the heart of aesthetics, and they're at the heart of my project. So what I will not do at Disputatio is explain to you why Chris Hemsworth is better looking than Benedict Cumberbatch. There are some of you in this room who are just objectively wrong, but I'm not here to help you answer those questions. What I am here today is to help you explain to you how Calvinism and Renaissance literature played a hand in shaping this. Where was I? Oh yeah, so I will not explain to you who's objectively more attractive. I will not supply you with the tools you need to unravel that problem. What I will do is explain to you how Calvinism and Renaissance literature shaped modern culture and the ways we think about beauty and the problems that we try to make sense of, all right? So to do that, I want to give everyone a brief overview of the history of aesthetics, how people have talked about beauty for the past 2,500 years. And this will be very brief because I know this is a room of people who read George Herbert, who are familiar with Plato. Most of these ideas I'm sure you're already familiar with, but I just want to make sure that we have a common vocabulary and an understanding of these issues. So if you look at the history of beauty and the philosophy of beauty, there's two distinctive phases. One I will call the pre-modern view. That's everything from classical Greece up until the 1700s, and then the modern view that begins with the Enlightenment. And in the pre-modern view of beauty, it begins with, as most things do, with Plato and Greek culture. So if you go back to the Greek philosophers, they were some of the first people in Western culture to systematically think about what is beauty, what is ugliness, how do we perceive it, how do we make sure that we're responding to it rightly. They were the first people to systematically analyze and probe these problems, all right? And I do imagine that they would have sat around for many hours debating whether Chris Hemsworth and Benedict Cumberbatch were more attractive. So this is the issues that the Greeks are interested in figuring out, the nature of beauty and how we respond to it. So the central text, of course, in Western aesthetics is Plato's Symposium. Show of hands, who's read the Symposium out of curiosity? Oh, it's wonderful to be in a room where people have read the Symposium. Okay, but many of you haven't. So if you're not familiar with the Symposium, this is Plato's key text on the nature of beauty. And so in the Symposium, a group of Greek philosophers have gathered together, and what they're doing is they're hanging out and they're drinking, they're eating olives, they're talking about the mysteries of the universe, and inevitably their conversation turns towards beauty. And so all these philosophers give eloquent speeches about the nature of beauty, what is beauty, how do we appreciate it, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, Socrates gets the floor, and he's the last person to speak, which is always a mistake. You never let Socrates go last because he'll just explain to the rest of you why you're all idiots. And so Socrates proceeds to school everyone at the Symposium about the nature of beauty and what really is beauty. And so in his speeches, Socrates reveals what we now refer to as the Platonic Ladder. And so I have a passage here I want to read to you. Basically, in a nutshell, Socrates' idea is that physical beauty is a manifestation or reflection of the divine, and that every physical object we experience, whether it's a beautiful person or a beautiful work of art or a sunset or a mountaintop, is meant to trace us back to the divine and to help us appreciate the ultimate source of beauty. And so Socrates, as he's speaking to the guests at the party, says, you should use the things of this world as rungs in a ladder. You start by loving one attractive body and step up to two. From there you move on to physical beauty in general, and from there to the beauty of people's activities, and from there to the beauty of intellectual endeavors, and from there you ascend to the final intellectual endeavor, which is no more and no less than the study of that beauty, so that you finally recognize true beauty. So the idea of this Platonic ladder is that we start out here in the physical, and we start with the physical, and we enjoy the physical, but the physical is ultimately meant to connect us back to something greater. And so you can easily see how this idea becomes Christianized in the first century because it corresponds to how Christians tend to think about the glory of God, right? The psalmist tells us the heavens declare the glory of God. The physical creation reflects its supernatural creator. And so we enjoy physical things, but we don't enjoy them for their own sake. We enjoy them for how they point us back to what's ultimately divine. And so we start off loving physical things, but then eventually we love moral things, or at least we should, according to Socrates, and then eventually we love the divine behind all of those things. And it has this idea of rationally pursuing beauty to its source, to the tracing everything back to where it all comes from, all right? Now, classical aesthetics, again, is presented in the Symposium. It's the central text in Western aesthetics, and it establishes three basic points that will be dominant through basically the next 2,000, 2,500 years, give or take, in Western culture. And so point number one is that beauty is real and beauty is objective. In other words, when you talk about something that's beautiful, you're talking about a real quality in things, in people, that exists independently of your perspective of them. This is key for Platonism. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder, according to Plato or Socrates. Another key idea in Western aesthetics is that when you talk about beauty, aesthetic experience, your experience of beauty, is primarily rational. We perceive beauty through the senses. So all of us tonight, when we look at the sunset, we have this sensory information coming through our eyes that's being registered and processed by our mind. But at that point, it goes from being a biological experience to a mental experience. And so our rational brains are supposed to kick in, they're supposed to process this information and see something greater going on than just a sunset, right? If you just look at the physical and enjoy the physical for its own sake, if you live at a pure sensory level, from a Neoplatonic perspective, you're not really having a true aesthetic experience. So for Plato, rational experience is supposed to direct you back to the true nature of beauty. The third point that Neoplatonism establishes is this idea that beauty is a transformative experience. If you are exposed to beauty, it makes you a better person. It improves your mind, it improves your soul, because if you use your rational brain to not just think about the physical, but the spiritual forces behind beauty, it draws you to something greater than yourself, and that experience is transformative. This is how Plato thinks about beauty. This is how Thomas Aquinas thinks about beauty. This is how Augustine thinks about beauty. For essentially 2,000, 2,500 years, these ideas are key to how Western culture discourses about beauty. Beauty is real, and it's a transformative experience when we have it. All of this shifts, though, in the 1700s. So in the 1700s, you have the Enlightenment. You have these German, French, Scottish philosophers coming in, and they're questioning the traditional paradigms that they've inherited from their classical and Christian sources, which rest very heavily on religious assumptions about human nature. And so the Enlightenment, moving away from those religious assumptions, eventually comes to the conclusion that beauty is actually not real. It's an entirely subjective experience. I want to read y'all a quote from David Hume. David Hume is not really arguing this. He's starting with this assumption, all right? And so when David Hume talks about beauty, he tells us, beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them, and each mind perceives a different beauty. One person may even perceive deformity, where another person is sensible of beauty. And every individual ought to acquiesce to his own sentiment without pretending to regulate those of others. To seek in the real beauty or real deformity is as fruitless an inquiry as to pretend to ascertain the real sweet or the real bitter. According to the disposition of the organs, the same object may be both sweet and bitter, and the proverb has justly determined it to be fruitless to dispute concerning tastes. It is very natural and thus common sense. Now, this passage, y'all, unlocked my dissertation. Sometimes when you're doing research, you never know where you're going to go. This passage struck me, because what struck me is so interesting about what Hume is saying here is not the idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's a commonplace. What struck me is that Hume is insisting it is a commonplace. In another place in his writings, Hume says that it's pointless to discuss the nature of beauty because every stable boy knows that beauty is just a subjective experience, and there's no objective standard we can use to resolve conversations like, who's more attractive, Benedict Cumberbatch or Chris Hemsworth. That's a pointless endeavor. And so one of the important things to remember about the Enlightenment is they break from the classical model of aesthetics, this idea that beauty is objective, that it's transformative, but they don't do it because a handful of intellectuals came along and argued this. These intellectuals came along and assumed this. They assumed that this was a cultural commonplace, that even the most common person on the street, a stable boy, knew beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And that's strange to me because for 2,000 years, European culture, under the influence of Plato and Neoplatonism, would not have assumed that. They would have argued the exact opposite. So something occurred between the pre-modern era and the modern era that led to this cultural shift that Hume is observing and responding to. All right? So when we talk about Enlightenment aesthetics or modern aesthetics, again, we're coming back to this idea beauty is subjective. And so when we talk about beauty, we're really saying something more about ourselves than we are the object we're looking at. When you tell me that a certain person is good looking or that you like one movie over another kind of movie, you're really revealing your own tastes. There's no objective standard to resolve these. And so for Plato, beauty reveals the real. For Hume, beauty reveals the self. It tells me about how I process information and respond to the world around me. But like I said, what's fascinating here is this is not something Hume is arguing. This is not something he thinks he has to prove. This is something he thought people believed and accepted, and it was a cultural commonplace. And so the goal of my project, when I started this as a graduate student, was to explain how did this happen? How did we move from the pre-modern view of beauty to the modern view? How did we move from classical aesthetics to Enlightenment aesthetics? How did we move from thinking for centuries that beauty is real, that it's objective? How did we move to this idea that it's entirely in the eye of the beholder? What happened between these two eras that led us to that shift? Now, there are two very key events that happened during this time period. One is the Protestant Reformation, and the other is the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical humanism. These events, which begin in the 1400s and have incredible cultural influence on Europe up until the 1600s, these are the two key events. And so my hypothesis when I started my research was these are the events that must have led to that break from the classical to the Enlightenment aesthetics. And so what I found is when we think about the Renaissance, we think about it as an era of great beauty, if you think about the Renaissance at all. I think about the Renaissance every morning, every night. It's my bread and butter, all right? Maybe you guys don't. But if you do think about the Renaissance, you probably think about beauty. You probably think about Brunelleschi's dome in Florence and this wonderful feat of architecture. You probably think about Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. Has anybody ever been to the Sistine Chapel? Raise your hand, right? It's an incredible experience, except it hurts your neck because you have to look up like this and you get about 5 minutes to look at it. But it's an incredible experience. It's amazing that one person could have produced this. It's an incredible aesthetic experience. We might think about Shakespeare's sonnets or George Herbert or John Donne, these literary works of beauty. So when we think about the Renaissance, we're accustomed to seeing it as an era of great beauty, and the bulk of Renaissance scholarship treats the Renaissance as if it was just this era where a group of people revisited classical antiquity, they were heavily influenced by Neoplatonism, and so they just regurgitated all the ideas that people had believed in ancient Greece and the Roman Empire and medieval Europe. They just regurgitated without changing or modifying anything. But what I found in my research is that's not the case. When Renaissance people talked about beauty, yes, many of them did talk about it in Neoplatonic terms. They talked about beauty as if it was real. They talked about it as if it was this transformative experience. But there's also a lot of what I've eventually called aesthetic skepticism. That's my term that I've coined to describe this. Because when a lot of people write about beauty in the Renaissance, they treat it as if it's this thing that they're very afraid we don't see and perceive rightly. A lot of Renaissance writers believe that we human beings, for whatever reason, do not have the capacity to perceive beauty rightly, or if we do, to respond to it rightly. And there's this pervasive growth of aesthetic skepticism. And the argument of my project is that aesthetic skepticism plays a key role in how you get from Plato's aesthetics to Hume's aesthetics, how you get from this idea that beauty is objective and real to the idea that beauty is subjective and it just tells you about yourself, not some sort of ultimate reality. And I believe that the two forces that led to this aesthetic, well, there are many forces, but I believe two of the key forces are Reformed theology, specifically Calvinism, and Renaissance literature. So let me start with Calvinism, right? So one of the assumptions people often make about Calvinism, at least in secular academia, is that Calvin, like most of the reformers, was hostile to art, all right? That people hated art if they were Protestant. And this is because of things like the iconoclastic movement, where Protestants were going in and destroying Catholic art in churches and religious settings and things like that. And maybe people associate Calvinism with the Puritans, who were much more uncomfortable with aspects of Renaissance culture and things like that. But the reality is Calvin deeply cared about beauty. It was something that was hugely important to him. Now, when he writes about beauty in his institutes and other places, he doesn't have much to say about like beauty in literature or beauty, physical beauty in human beings, but he does talk a great deal about the beauty of nature. So for Calvin, art is something that's important, but it's something that's often abused. And so that's why some people, when they talk about Calvinism and the arts, assume that Calvin's take is largely negative. In the Institutes in Book 1, Calvin explains he's not anti-aesthetic. He says, because the arts are the gifts of God, I seek a pure and legitimate use of each as things which the Lord has conferred upon us for his glory and our good. If I had to define Calvinism, I wouldn't define it as a tulip or some other acronym like that. I would say the heart of Calvinism is the right perception and the right response to the glory of God. And beauty for Calvin is a key ingredient of that. But like I said, he rarely talks about art or literature. Those don't seem to be big concerns for Calvin, but he loved nature. In his book, Ravished by Beauty, the scholar Belden Lane argues that Calvin was enraptured by nature. He writes, Calvin believed in a God of ravishing beauty whose attributes were mirrored so generously and flagrantly in the world of nature. I would say that Calvin, in one sense, is a Platonist because he was trained as a classical humanist. He was heavily influenced by Platonist ideas, and Calvin believes that in our original pre-fallen condition, what we were meant to do is perceive God's glory, and we were meant to worship it. One of Calvin's most common metaphors that he uses to describe the beauty of nature is a theater. In the same way that you guys are gathered together here, you're watching me, Calvin believes that we are meant to be gathered together, seated in the theater of God's glory, and watch the spectacle of divine glory on stage. He talks about this over and over again. He says, wherever you turn your eyes, there's no portion of the world, however minute, that does not exhibit at least some of the sparks of beauty. While it is impossible to contemplate the vast and beautiful fabric as it extends round without being overwhelmed by the immense weight of glory. Hence the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews elegantly describes the visible world as images of the invisible, the elegant structures of the world serving as a kind of mirror in which we may behold God, though otherwise invisible. In later places in the Institutes, he says, being placed in this most beautiful theater, let us not decline to take a pious delight in the clear and manifest works of God. And so I think this is key to understanding how Calvin thinks about beauty. That like Plato says, we are meant to see beauty, we are meant to experience it, and we are meant to be made better by it. But Calvin has something in his worldview that Plato doesn't. He has a view of total depravity. He has a belief that human beings are fundamentally fallen. And so because we are fallen, Calvin believes that in every area of our life, nothing functions the way God intended. Everything is a distorted image of that. And so people do not respond to beauty the way we were originally intended to. We were meant to be seated in that theater and to enjoy divine glory, but so often that's not how it works. So Calvin also, when he talks about beauty, he uses these images of fogs or clouds or smokes. If you think of a rainy day or a stormy day or a foggy day where you're out and you can't see anything around you, that's how Calvin thinks about the world. And so when Calvin is talking about human reason and how it helps us understand or not understand reality, he says, if men are only naturally taught, in other words, guided by their fallen reason, instead of having any distinct, solid, or certain knowledge, they fasten only on contradictory principles and in consequence worship an unknown God. Later he says, the light of reason is so smothered by the clouds and darkness that it cannot shine forth to any good effect. So to understand Calvin's thinking, you have to understand he's always contrasting the way things were supposed to be with the way things are. How human beings function in the Garden of Eden and how they function when we were expelled from the Garden of Eden. So for Calvin, beauty is something that was meant to draw us closer to God. It was something that was supposed to be powerful and transformative. But more often than not, for Calvin, a fallen person, someone who is totally depraved, when they encounter beauty, it does not draw them outside of themselves. It does, and oftentimes it makes them more entrenched in their sin, all right? Calvin's favorite metaphor for the human condition is the labyrinth. And of course, if you know your Greek mythology, this is a metaphor he's getting from the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. And over again, I believe it's 12 times in the Institutes, Calvin talks about the fallen mind as a kind of labyrinth or a maze of errors. And so what Calvin believes is we say we want the truth. We say we want what's good. We say we want these transformative things, but that would mean changing who we are and subordinating ourselves to a divine authority who is going to tell us that we're fallen and that we're sinful. And prideful people do not want that. And so rather than trying to find our way out of the labyrinth, we prefer to wander around in it. And this is how Calvin sees the human condition. And so for Calvinism and Neoplatonism line up in a lot of areas. They both believe that beauty is transformative, or it should be. They see human beings as created to experience something greater than themselves, and they believe that beauty plays a role in that. But like I said, Calvin has something that Platonism doesn't, which is a Christian view of human nature that accommodates sin and realizes how sin affects us. Platonism and the Neoplatonism that is commonly practiced in the Renaissance rests on this very optimistic view about human nature. If you are a Platonist in the Renaissance, or a Neoplatonist, I should say, you assume that human beings are inherently rational and that if they think about something logically, they will come to the right conclusion and they will do what's right. And when that's mapped into aesthetics, what that leads to is this idea that if you take a fallen person and you put beauty in front of them, they will respond to it rightly, and they will enjoy it, and they will be better for it. And in the Renaissance, like I said, there's this huge growth of aesthetic skepticism. As the Reformation spreads, as more and more people reclaimed a reformed understanding of human nature that includes the idea of total depravity, people start to realize that this Neoplatonic model of judgment is not really consistent with Reformed theology. And so there's this conflict between Calvinism and Platonism. In the 1620s, there was a huge fight between a group of people who were called the Cambridge Platonists and the Calvinist faculty there. And the Neoplatonists succeeded in driving out the Calvinist faculty at Cambridge. But this wasn't just an intellectual debate that was happening on college campuses. This was something that was happening at a popular level throughout culture. And that's because of Calvin's influence on Renaissance literature. So what I'm going to be doing with you guys over the course of the year is I'm going to be coming to talk with you about different key Renaissance texts and explaining how these Renaissance texts respond to Calvinism and how they pick up this concern with aesthetic skepticism. Now, one thing I'm definitely not arguing is that all of the people I talk about are Calvinists. Some of them I believe are, not all of them. I'm on the fence about where William Shakespeare's religious beliefs are. I tend to think that Shakespeare is a Catholic, personally. But I believe these people lived and operated in a culture that was dominated by Calvin's theology, and they shared his concern with rightly perceiving and understanding the world around them, but they were also deeply anxious about their ability to do that because of their fallen nature. And so to kind of illustrate these concepts and help you make sense of them and the vocabulary I use to talk about these texts, I want to give you two examples from literature. And so the first one comes, well, hang on, I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself. The first one comes from Spenser's Faerie Queene. And so to make sense of this, I want to explain that there's two kinds of aesthetic experience in the Renaissance that people are distinctly interested in. One is the experience of the elect, people that have been chosen by God, who have been brought to salvation, and beauty can oftentimes play a key role in that. If you read C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy, he talks about the role that beauty and joy played in his life and how God used literature to bring him to faith, right? So oftentimes beauty does draw us, but it's not because our rational brains are processing it and making sense of it and it's something we choose. It's the grace of God at work at something in the world to bring us to faith. But even when we're saved, that doesn't mean we always perceive and respond to the world rightly. We still struggle with sin, and we have to be sanctified. And so many Calvinists and people who are influenced in Calvinism are really interested in the role that beauty plays in sanctification and how fallen people who are struggling with sin, as they're being sanctified, respond to or fail to respond to beauty in a God-honoring way. But you also have this intense interest in the reprobate, the person who's fallen, who is not chosen by God for salvation, and how they respond to these wonderful gifts, that marvelous theater that Calvin talks about, and their persistent failure to perceive the glory of God. And there's intense interest in the Renaissance in diagnosing that psychology and figuring out how it works. The Renaissance scholar Deborah Sugar has argued that John Calvin is in many ways the forerunner or the forefather of modern psychology, because she argues that Calvin was intensely interested in inner experience and the inner life and how sin potentially distorts that subjectivity. And so Calvin, what it does is, Calvin believes beauty is real, but he believes we don't perceive and respond to beauty. And so when a fallen person responds to beauty, oftentimes they're not really talking about the real world that's external to them. They're telling you about their own fallen condition. And this is why Calvin essentially functions as a bridge between classical aesthetics and modern aesthetics. He's this transitional figure because he believes beauty is real, but he believes we don't perceive it and respond to it the way we should. And so when a fallen person says something about aesthetics, they're oftentimes more revealing their own fallen nature than the object or the thing that they're discussing. So let me tell you a little bit about The Faerie Queen. This is a poem that I deeply hated for many, many years. My professor forced me to read it in college, and I thought, what is this? And I got to the end of it, and I realized it's not even finished, and then I hated it more. But then I came to love it. So who's read The Faerie Queen out of curiosity? All right, wonderful, wonderful. It's amazing to be in a room of people who've read The Faerie Queen. So if you haven't read The Faerie Queen, let me tell you a little bit about it for context. So in The Faerie Queen, specifically book 1, it's this medieval allegory. And the allegory, excuse me, it's a Renaissance poem that's playing with medieval allegories and medieval chivalric romances. And The Faerie Queen works on many, many levels. There's all sorts of symbolism and deeper significance. But one way you can read The Faerie Queen is as an allegory of the Christian life. It's about how we go from being fallen and sinful to holy, and the process that it takes to make us holy, all right? And unlike medieval allegories, which oftentimes emphasize self-effort, the Faerie Queen over and over again emphasizes our total depravity and our dependence on the salvific work of Jesus Christ. And so in the Faerie Queen, you have two main characters. There's tons of characters, but these are the two you need to know if you haven't read it. One is Red Cross Knight, all right? I just like this picture of him, but in the poem, he's a significantly younger person. It's hard to find pictures of like 20-year-old guys who are dressed in armor. You have to find grizzled, rough, tough-looking guys like this. But in the Faerie Queen, Red Cross Knight, who I believe represents the individual Christian on his spiritual journey, is this young knight who's eager to go out and have his first adventure. And his first adventure is to protect this woman named Una, who I believe represents the true church, all right? So you have the individual Christian and you have the church, and they're supposed to go together on their journey to fight a dragon. And book 1 of the Faerie Queen is about all of the adventures and the misadventures they have as they go through their journey. So as they go on their journey, they eventually make their way through this very magical woods where all sorts of terrible things happen to them, and they find what is literally called the Den of Errors. And Red Cross Knight, because he's a dude, goes, I think I should crawl in there and see what's going on. And Una goes, don't do it, man. Nothing good is going to happen. And Red Cross Knight says, no, I really think I need to go in there. And he says something really interesting, because she warns him. She says, in this wandering wood, this is error's den, a monster vile, whom God and man does hate. She says, therefore I read, beware, fly, fly. And Red Cross Knight responds to her, and in Spenser's, pseudo, Middle English language, he says, virtue gives herself light, through darkness for to wade. In other words, what he's saying to Una there is, I've got this because I'm a good person. And if you're a good person, your moral goodness will guide you. Virtue provides its own self-light. And so because Red Cross Knight trusts in his own virtue and his own wisdom, he crawls into the den of error, and then he quickly discovers that Una's warning was right, all right? This does turn out to be the home of a vile monster, specifically a woman who is half snake and half human. And she wraps her coils around Red Cross Knight, and he fights helplessly. The more he relies on his own strength, the more he relies on his own power, the more encoiled he gets by error. And so at one point, he looks like he's going to die. There's no way out. And Una calls into the cave, into the darkness, and says, have faith. All right? And when Red Cross Knight transitions his perspective from his own reason, his own virtue, his own strength, to faith, when he transfers his perspective to something that is external to himself, then he's able to free himself from error. All right? I think this is Spenser's understanding of what the Christian life is like, that we spend all our days and nights coiled up in error, trapped by it, until we direct our understanding to something that's greater than ourselves, till we look to Christ, not ourselves. But there's something really interesting that happens to me, because error, when she's attacking Red Cross Knight, literally vomits all over him, all right? She pukes all over him. Spenser's an incredibly visual poet. He loves dynamic visual images. And so when he crawls out of the den of error, Red Cross Knight is soaked with error's vomit. He's soaked with error. And the rest of the poem, one way you can read it, is an allegory of sanctification or purification where Red Cross Knight has to become clean. But because he's not clean, because he's not holy, because he's soaked and contaminated by error, he is prone to manipulation, all right? Red Cross Knight's big enemy in the poem, though he doesn't know it for most of the poem, is Archimago. And there's various ways you can interpret who Archimago is. I believe he represents the Catholic Church, the Pope, trying to challenge the true church. But he also represents the visual, the sensory world. He's the master of images, the high image. And so Archimago is a master of images, and he's constantly creating forms out of nothing to deceive Red Cross Knight. Through his magic, he convinces Red Cross Knight that Una is promiscuous, that she's been unfaithful to him, and he persuades Red Cross Knight to abandon her and leave her in the woods and strike out on his own. And so Red Cross Knight, because he is stained by error, because he is not free from error yet, he is prone to make mistakes. And one of the biggest mistakes he makes is he falls in love with this woman named Duessa, aka Fidessa, who represents the false church. And he makes her his lady, and he dedicates his whole life to protecting her. And she drags him deeper and deeper into error. And so because he's so struggling with error, Red Cross Knight is, because he's elect, but he's still struggling with his own sanctification, he has to go on this journey to learn how to understand the difference between truth and lies, between goodness and evil, between beauty and ugliness. And Red Cross Knight, his temptation is to always judge the physical form, to look at the outside, never the inward. And so part of his spiritual journey is learning how to look at beauty rightly. And I think that Spenser is saying many things here, but I think as a Calvinist and as a poet, he thinks deeply that as fallen people, we do not respond to beauty rightly. We are much more like Red Cross Knight than we realize. There's a great scene in The Fairy Queen where Red Cross Knight stumbles into the House of Pride, and they're having a great party there, everybody's drinking, and he proceeds to hang out there. And the 7 deadly sins come in, and they literally perform in front of them. He sees all these sins in front of them, and he's looking at them, but he doesn't see them as sin. He doesn't flee from the House of Pride. It's only when the mist clears and he looks down and he sees these bodies on the floor, these people who've gotten trapped in the House of Pride and have not been able to escape, that he realizes he has a problem. And so for Red Cross Knight, his true spiritual journey only begins when he reaches the House of Holiness, which is the opposite of the House of Pride. And there he's cleansed, he's purified, and this is where he starts to realize that because he doesn't have that self-light of virtue, he has to rely on reason, but more importantly, he has to rely on faith. And through faith and through his relationship with the true church, through Una, he starts to learn not only to recognize the weaknesses in himself, but the weaknesses in the world around them. And so Spenser is doing many things here. I think he's making an allegory about the Christian life, but I think he's also making an argument about beauty, that fallen people tend to live in a world of things that look beautiful, but they actually aren't beautiful. And because of their sin, because of their fallenness, we take these things, we misuse them, we misinterpret them, and they end up destroying us. And so in The Fairy Queen, he gives us this Calvinist picture of what it looks like to sort through and discern truth from falsity, goodness from evil, ugliness from beauty, and to understand how our own fallenness affects our ability to answer these things. And you will see, I will talk with you about many Renaissance writers, especially John Donne, George Herbert, who operate with, I think, a Calvinist worldview, and they see our fallen condition as an issue for our aesthetic experience. And that to truly have a genuine aesthetic experience that is transformative in the way Plato talks about it, you have to be transformed in your heart and your soul and your mind by the grace of God. Without that, you will respond to beauty in a very different way. An example of that is Dr. Faustus. Who's read Dr. Faustus out of curiosity? Okay, fewer of you. Okay, all right. So usually my students hate Dr. Faustus because they hate the character Dr. Faustus. And I have to remind them, I think you're meant to hate Dr. Faustus. So if you haven't read Dr. Faustus is about a humanist scholar who incidentally attends the University of Wittenberg. What important event happened at Wittenberg, y'all? 95 Theses. All right, excellent. I was going to say Hamlet goes to school there, but I'll accept Martin Luther as a substitute. All right, so it's the school of Hamlet, it's the school of Martin Luther, it's also the school of Dr. Faustus. And so Dr. Faustus is a humanist who claims that he's acquired all knowledge and it's bored him. There's nothing left for him to study. And so he turns to the study of black magic. And he summons up the devil in the form of Mephistopheles, and he asks Mephistopheles to broker a deal between him and Satan, and he gives up his immortal soul in exchange for 24 years of power. And at the end of the play, the clock is ticking. Dr. Faustus is about to be dragged to hell, and a group of his friends beg him to repent. They tell him, Faustus, it's not too late. God will accept you. That deal you made with the devil is not binding. God will forgive you if you just repent. And Faustus doesn't repent. And that's the heart of the dilemma of Dr. Faustus, is why does he not do it? Dr. Faustus is a brilliant analysis of a reprobate psychology. It's about a person who has fallen and has these opportunities to seize the grace that's been offered to him, but he doesn't do it because of his own fallen condition. And the play delves very deeply into what it's like to be a fallen person caught up in your own fallenness, to be wandering that Calvinist labyrinth and not want to find your way out of it. And so Dr. Faustus is freaking out about what's about to happen to him, and he turns to Mephistopheles and he says, Mephistopheles, do me a favor. I need to be distracted from my impending judgment. And so he asks Mephistopheles to use his power to summon up the ghost of Helen of Troy, who according to classical mythology is the most beautiful woman in the world. And so in this famous scene from Faustus, this woman magically appears on the stage. I always wonder about how they would have made this happen in the Renaissance with, Renaissance stagecraft. But this woman just magically appears, as I imagine it, out of a puff of smoke, and Faustus is in awe of her beauty. And so he gives this famous speech here. I think this is probably one of the key speeches in Dr. Faustus. He turns to Helen and he says, was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burned the topless towers of Ilium? Sweet Helen, make me immortal with a kiss. Her lips suck forth my soul, see where it flies. Come, Helen, come and give me my soul again. Here will I dwell, for heaven is in these lips, and all is dross that is not Helena. I will be Paris, and for love of thee, instead of Troy, shall Wittenberg be sacked. And I will combat with weak Menelaus, and wear thy colors on my plumed crest. Yea, I will wound Achilles in the heel, and then return to Helen for a kiss. O, thou art fairer than the evening air, clad in the beauty of 1,000 stars. Brighter art thou than the flaming Jupiter when he appeared to hapless Semele, more lovely than the monarch of the sky in wanton Arethusa's azure arms. And none but thou shalt be my paramour. So what stands out to me, y'all, in this speech is Faustus is in this predicament. He knows he's going to face divine judgment. He knows he has two choices. He can repent or he can continue on the path towards his own damnation. But as a reprobate, he chooses to continue on the path towards his own damnation. But that is a hard road to walk. It is hard to see hell and keep walking straight towards it. And so what Faustus asks for is a distraction. And what he asks to distract him is beauty. And so he summons up the symbol of not just beauty, but all classical wisdom, all right? The Iliad, the Odyssey, those are the key texts of ancient Greece. If they had a Bible, that might have been it, right? The source of all their wisdom, all their knowledge comes out of those texts. They were key to their cultures. And so he symbols up this woman who's not just beautiful in her own sake, but she symbolizes the humanist tradition that has led Faustus astray, this over-reliance on reason, divorced from faith. And so what stands out to me is when he's praising Helen, notice the language he uses. When he says, was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burned the topless towers of Ilium? I mean, just think about that, y'all. And girls, imagine if your boyfriend turns to you and goes, your face is so beautiful, a lot of people would be massacred for it, right? It's a compliment, but it's probably not the compliment you want, right? So Faustus is trying not to think about destruction. He's trying not to think about damnation. But when he praises Helen, he praises her beauty, and he praises it in the language of destruction. He can't separate her beauty from the consequences of her beauty. He praises her as the face that launched 1,000 Greek ships to battle and burnt the towers of Troy. And over again, when he talks about her, he repeatedly comes back to this language of destruction. Now, Faustus thinks he's writing a beautiful sonnet and he's wooing Helen with this romantic language, but there's two experiences of this. There's Faustus's experience, and there's our experience as hopefully the elect reader or the elect viewer in the play watching this. And what we get to realize is that Faustus is a reprobate. He's locked into his depravity. He doesn't want to find his way out of Calvinist labyrinth, and that shapes his response to beauty. And so what he should be thinking about, what Helen's beauty should be giving him incentive to do, is to turn his heart back to Christ. But it doesn't do that. It traps him deeper in that labyrinth. But even when he's trapped in that labyrinth, he's still using the language of destruction. He's still using the language of damnation. And so even when he's trying not to think about those things, he's still thinking about them, and that's revealed in his speech. So what I will be talking about you with as these lectures go forward, we'll be talking about Shakespeare, Thomas Middleton, we'll be talking about John Donne, George Herbert, John Milton. We'll be looking at canonical and lesser canonical poets and playwrights from the Renaissance, some whom were Calvinists, some were not, and we'll be exploring how Calvin shapes their concerns about our ability to, one, perceive beauty rightly, and two, respond to it rightly. And we'll be exploring both the psychology of the elect person who is trying to grow in their sanctification, and beauty plays a role in that, and the reprobate who could have beauty, who could have the glory of God staring them in the face, but could turn around and go the opposite direction. This is something that Plato struggles to explain because he doesn't operate with a Christian view of human nature. This is something, on the other hand, that Calvinism does explain, and this leads to this aesthetic skepticism. And again, it's not the idea that beauty is not real or that it's subjective, it's the idea that we, as fallen people, seated in the spectacle of God's glory, don't perceive it rightly unless God is at work in our hearts to do that. And so what we're going to do as we go through these lectures together is kind of explore these texts and what they have to say about this aesthetic experience and how it relates to our fallen condition and the work that God is doing or not doing in all of our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Cole. Can you hear me? Yes. These are the lectures I've been waiting for all my life.
So one of the ways that when I talk about my project, I think people hear something that I don't mean them to hear, is that Calvin's argument is that beauty is all subjective and it's not real. That's not what I'm trying to say. Calvin, again, thinks beauty is real, but our experience of it oftentimes says more about our fallen condition than the nature of beauty. And so some of the leading Enlightenment philosophers were actually Scottish people who were raised in deeply Calvinist environments. And so I think that what happens by the time we get to people like David Hume is they've rejected Calvinism, but they've retained his skeptical view of human nature. David Hume, of course, is the father of modern skepticism, and there's deep anxiety about human nature. And I think that comes from kind of like it's a Calvinist anthropology without a Calvinist soteriology, is how I would explain it.
That makes sense. So the skepticism, the aesthetic skepticism you talked about, is a correction of Plato, and you think it's a good thing, right? Ultimately, is there any negative cultural side effects to that?
Yeah, so I would say that I kind of see myself as I always tell my students, I don't teach literature, I teach culture, and my goal is to explain a group of beliefs and values that dominate a particular era. And so that leads me to do a lot of work on intellectual history and the history of ideas. And so I would say Calvinism's correction of Plato is very important, but all ideas eventually, especially when they lose sight of their Christian origins, can have destructive consequences. So I think Platonism or Calvinism divorced from that redemptive aspect eventually leads to just a pessimistic view of human nature, an obsession with your own, self-consciousness and your own perspective of things. And I think that that's what we're getting in the Enlightenment. You could make the same argument with the Protestant Reformation, that it's a wonderful thing, but it produces a lot of schisms and a tendency to split over things as inane as the kind of worship music we use or things like that. And so every idea, when it's divorced from the truth that keeps it moored down, has a negative consequence. So I do think Calvinism leads to some unfortunate things, but I don't think that's because of the inherent ideas in Calvinism, if that makes sense.
Do you think it leads, so it just deteriorates into romanticism maybe? Romantic poets, they're very focused on the self. Is that a distorted kind of downstream view of this as well?
I think so, yes. I'm actually going through a book study at my own school on it's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman, where he talks about this obsession with my own identity and expressing my own identity. And I think that, in some ways Calvinism does contribute to that, because like Deborah Sugar argues, Calvin is very fascinated with how sin corrupts your perspective of reality. Because according to Calvin in the Institutes, all knowledge depends on, one, self-knowledge and knowledge of God. But then Calvin argues that both of those things are tainted by sin, so how do you know yourself? How do you know God? Calvin is very interested in examining the classical humanist goal of knowing yourself, but also realizing that self-knowledge is not really capable without divine revelation. And so I think that this is all part of that in some way.
You could say Romanticism is a Calvinist heresy.
That's one way of thinking of it. I don't think the Romantics would have liked that. But, I'm also teaching Frankenstein right now, and Mary Shelley did love her John Milton and some Puritan ideas, even though I don't think she understood them. So
when we get to is the next lecture on Donne and Herbert?
No, that will be the third lecture.
Okay. So then we'll get more into their view of the self. And
Yes, in the next lecture, I'm going to be talking about Renaissance tragedies, and we're going to be talking about female beauty specifically, and how Renaissance people tend to think about female beauty, and their conflicted attitudes about that. So we'll be looking at some Shakespeare, and we'll be looking at my boy Thomas Middleton, who virtually no one has read. So hopefully you all be inspired to go read some Thomas Middleton.
Yeah, what can we read to prepare for that next lecture?
If you want to prepare for that, you can read Shakespeare's Othello, and you can read The Changeling by Thomas Middleton. That's what the article that I published is on The Changeling. So it's having kind of a moment right now, not because of me, but it's a popular play. It's probably Middleton's it's the most popular play of an obscure playwright.
Okay, very good. Questions from the audience?
If viewing beauty from a Calvinistic point of view is a valuable and transforming experience, but we who suffer under the human condition can only view beauty through fog or in a labyrinth, how can we more clearly see and understand beauty in the world around us?
That is a great question, and therein lies the rub, as Hamlet would say. So Calvinism is, in one sense, paradoxical because it emphasizes our total depravity and how that affects our ability to perceive the world rightly. But on the other hand, it emphasizes the idea that through divine grace we can perceive reality rightly and we can respond to it rightly. And so I think that entirely depends on our relationship with God. But how do you know that you're in a right relationship with God? How do you know that God is sanctifying you? These are pressing questions that every Christian wrestles with, and they were especially pressing in the Reformation era. And so I think one of the reasons I believe Renaissance literature is amazing is because it helps us watch and explore these theological dilemmas. George Herbert, John Donne, especially, they're poets of the soul, and they talk about, they are early psychiatrists who are trying to map out how these things work. I don't know that there's the short answer is always the Sunday school answer, Jesus. Jesus is what allows us to do that. But the long answer is a lot more complex because it does depend on knowing that God is at work in your life, and then that raises the question, how do you know that? These are things that people worried about and debated and struggled with the Renaissance, and their literature shows us what that looks like. So I don't even know if that answers your question, but that's what I would say. Thank you.
How or do you think that our disillusionment to what beauty is affects the courage of men?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So, a key...
You mean like to get a girl?
Yes and no.
If you like her, you should ask her out. That's the short answer to that question. Don't tell her face will launch 1,000 ships, though. It only needs to launch one ship. I think maybe referencing some kind of ideas that like C.S. Lewis talks about in The Abolition of Man, and he talks about this idea that beauty is subjective. He has a famous example of Coleridge supposedly went to see a waterfall, I think in Switzerland, and one tourist said, "Oh, it's sublime," and the other person said it's pretty, and Coleridge said, "The sublime guy is going somewhere, the pretty guy is going nowhere." That's a very bad paraphrase of that passage, but it's this idea that like C.S. Lewis says we've created men without chests, like men who don't believe in absolutes, and we just see everything as subjective. And so I do think that all of these things are interconnected, because for Plato, and I think he's right about this, beauty is inseparable from truth, and truth is inseparable from goodness. They form a holy trinity. So to talk about one or to question one is to question all of those things. So there is a degree of moral relativism that comes from this aesthetic skepticism when you just let it run away from you. So beauty is real, and we need to stand up for that and appreciate that. So I think these are, if you're weak on beauty and you're soft on these issues, then it can lead to a lack of courage to stand up for other things, because these things are, for the classical writers, they were connected. For the Christian writers, they were connected, and I think they should be connected for us as well.
Do you think that our modern Calvinistic churches have a good objective view of beauty that still aligns with Calvin's own teaching? Do you think that we've kind of strayed away and maybe adopted a more shallow view of beauty, or even a more secular and progressive view of beauty?
That's a great question, and I think it depends entirely on the church that you're part of. Because we're certainly not all uniform in these matters. But I think one thing the The Reformers overcorrected on was the role of beauty in worship, because they were coming out of Catholicism, and Catholicism relies so heavily on the sensory experience, and for Reformers that was a distraction from the Word. And so I do think that, as far as today goes, it really just depends on the church and the situation. But I think some churches, they see that everything has to be minimalist, everything has to be purged of any kind of, aesthetic element. And I think that's a real problem. I mean, David says that his heart's goal was to be in the temple of the Lord and to gaze constantly at the beauty of the Lord. I think the beauty of God and perception of that is the end goal of the Christian experience. So if we're in a church that's not appreciating that, whether it's Reformed or not, I don't think we're doing our job right, so to speak.
So you mentioned that the Renaissance and Enlightenment, they kept the idea of man as depraved, but at the same time, like in the Renaissance and Enlightenment, we see a lot of pride in man's reason, and he can know everything. How do those ideas relate in their minds?
Well, it really depends on, which part of the Renaissance you're talking about, because in the Renaissance, you've got two groups of people. You have Christian humanists who lean heavily and rest their ideas on a foundation of Christian doctrine. And then you have humanists who are kind of paving the way for secular humanism. Dr. Faustus is the quintessential example of that. And so those humanists tend to be heavily influenced by Plato. They tend to associate sin with the body, with passion, with the physical. And then they tend to associate good with reason and spirituality. And so they operate with a very binary view of the world. And so in some way, I have found one major error that a lot of scholars make is they tend to talk about all of Renaissance humanism as if they were just proto-Enlightenment thinkers. But the Enlightenment idea of reason elevating us above superstition and dogma, that has its correspondence in a lot of Renaissance thinkers. So when you talk about Renaissance humanism, it's tricky because it's not a monolithic institution, but there were definitely some thinkers who paved the pathway towards Enlightenment thinking. On the other hand, you have a lot of people that I would call anti-humanists, like the French essayist Michel de Montaigne, who's probably one of the biggest influences on Shakespeare. He was hugely critical of this idea that through reason alone we can know the world and make sense of things. And so you have this kind of prideful, self-centered humanist discourse that contends with an anti-humanist discourse. And a lot of people who are driving the anti-humanist discourse are Christians, and they're humanists in the sense that they believe in the dignity and value of humanity and that all of our faith should recognize and appreciate that, but they're anti-humanist in the sense that they don't like the idea of the individual who's divorced from any kind of authority. There's a great line in Hamlet where Hamlet's meditating on the problem of humanism, and he says, have we reached a state where basically there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so? And that's what I think Hamlet is meditating on, is this humanist dilemma. Are you the ultimate authority in the universe? And so in some ways, I do think the Renaissance tries to dig in its heels and stop us from getting in the Enlightenment. In a lot of ways, it leads directly to it.
So you mentioned that there is Renaissance literature which was talking about medieval allegories, and you were talking about the ideas of beauty on that. What about medieval literature proper? Were there any trends on the spectrum of aesthetic skepticism or more of a Platonic view from European literature from like 500 AD before the Renaissance?
Oh, great question. I'm going to have to think about that because, again, medieval literature, it's almost impossible to generalize. And there's so much complexity in the examples of like Geoffrey Chaucer. You can read the Canterbury Tales as this kind of essentially Catholic work. You can see some people have argued that Chaucer was influenced by the Lollards and John Wycliffe, and he was a proto-reformer. So medieval literature is quite complex. So I want to be wary of making any generalizations about it because it's definitely not I teach a lot of medieval literature, but it's not my expertise. But I would say anywhere you find people who are committed to a biblical understanding of sin and how it affects us, you're going to find these kinds of ideas. Much of I think Augustine was heavily influenced by Plato, but Augustine, of course, is one of the primary influences on John Calvin. So you'll find these ideas in Plato. A kind of a quintessential example of this, I would say, is the dilemma in the Confessions, where Augustine is meditating on why he stole the pear or destroyed the pears. Do y'all remember this? He and his friends broke into a friend's or neighbor's yard, and they took his pears, and he's trying to figure out what motivated him. And the reason he's having trouble is because he's trained as a Platonist. And for a Platonist, all human activity is a response to beauty and goodness. And so he can't figure out, why did I steal something if I didn't like the pears? They weren't beautiful to look at. They didn't taste good. And I don't have any kind of grievance against my neighbor. He can't find a good explanation for his behavior within traditional Platonic models of behavior. And so what he has to fall back on is his biblical understanding of human nature, that fallen people do bad stuff because sin distorts your understanding of what's good. And so anywhere you find people who have a biblical worldview, you're going to find people talking about these ideas. I think you might find them in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I'm teaching that right now. I think it has some of these ideas in it, but I don't think they become especially prominent due to the influence of the Catholic Church until the Renaissance and Reformation era.
So John Owen, 17th century Puritan, he once preached a sermon titled "The Nature and Beauty of Gospel Worship," where he displays a clear zeal to preserve beauty in worship, but he disconnects it entirely from carnal trappings. He's responding to Catholicism. But he says that God has a concern for beauty in worship, and he even goes so far as to say that any worship that doesn't display this concern for beauty is godless. But that his emphasis on beauty is entirely on the spiritual, a beauty that can't be seen in the physical. So can you expand more on on the unique emphasis that Calvinists brought to the beauty of spiritual things that can't be detected with the senses?
Okay, so that's a very important issue, because I think all people in Western culture who operate in the shadow of Plato struggle with a binary between body and soul, because in Platonism, the soul tends to be good and the body is bad. Sin comes from bodily desires. The soul pulls you upwards, the body pulls you downwards. And so that tension between the physical and the spiritual, that's a key issue that is common in a lot of Western culture. And, was it Owen who said, always be killing sin, or sin will be killing you, right? Mortifying the flesh. I think a lot of Christians tend to think about, when Paul talks about, mortifying the flesh, or John Owen talks about that, we tend to associate that with actual physical desires, and we tend to treat our souls, or if our souls are immune to sin. And a lot of the literature that I'm going to be going through with you guys really challenges that binary. So for example, I'll give you a sneak preview of coming attractions. One of the things that makes it really hard for people to talk about female beauty in the Renaissance is Neoplatonists believe that if you are a beautiful woman, you have a good soul. If you are an ugly woman, you have a bad soul, because physical and spiritual have to match up, right? And so there are a lot of Renaissance men, at least in plays, who get themselves in trouble because they see a woman and go, she's really beautiful, so she must be a good person. And so that tension, that binary between body and spirit, is something that a lot of Renaissance writers deconstruct. They challenge this idea. And so, but I think even Calvinists, I think Sir Philip Sidney is a Calvinist, but he talks about how he's like, it's impossible to find ugly people attractive because they have bad souls. Like, if you're ugly, you have a bad soul. That's just the way it is. That's a very Platonic idea. And so a lot of people fall into that and get influenced by that. And I think a lot of the literature that I'm looking at tries to navigate that tension.
Okay, Gideon, last question.
All right, so we're given, we live in a world where we have this standard of beauty, but you might have touched on it briefly, but I wanted to know, is there room for preference, or, can there be, or is there ought to be any preference?
Of course. I think, I'm really into cognitive psychology and neuroscience, and especially when it deals with aesthetics. And so one of the things we found is that, a lot of the people that we traditionally tend to find good looking have a certain kind of facial symmetry or certain facial features. And so in some degree, there are a lot of the physical features we're attracted to are associated with fertility. So there's scientific evidence suggests that in a lot of ways, beauty is actually objective. And we can thank Aristotle for that, because Aristotle was the first person after Plato to say, It's more than just appreciating the heavenly. There are actual physical reasons to think about that. But there's also the room for, personal taste is for sure there. And what I always emphasize to my students when we talk about this is it takes a whole lifetime to shape your tastes. Tastes always seem random or subjective, but a whole lifetime of events went into those. And so I think taste is actually the difference in taste is something to celebrate because it's a reflection of the work that God has done in your life to prepare you and make you who you are. I always love it when I encounter someone who loves something really passionately that I don't, because it lifts the burden off me to have to love that. And I love that this person is passionate about that and they respect that. And I think that is true of all personal taste. I'll close with this note because this does get into personal issues and things like this. There's a great scene in the novel The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Have y'all read that? Okay, where there's this in that novel, Earth is destroyed, and it later turns out that it was actually just an alien supercomputer that was built to calculate information to find the mysteries of the universe, and it blows up before it can generate the answer. And so the sole survivor of planet Earth meets this alien scientist or architect who designed some things in Earth, and he goes, "Have you been to Norway by any chance? Did you see the fjords?" And they all look at him, and the survivor of planet Earth goes, "No, I'm sorry I didn't." He goes, "Oh, that's really disappointing. I won an award for them. They were really beautiful." And so one of the things I think about is that the world is full of things not all of us are going to get to love and that not all of us will appreciate, but God sees and appreciates each and every one of those things. And so your personal taste to me is often a reflection of where God is calling you to love and to appreciate and to find beautiful. And other people may not share that. Other people may not love that, but God does, because God has made all things. God finds all his handiwork beautiful. And so I think oftentimes personal taste is a reflection of God calling you to love something because you specifically have been called to that. So yes, I certainly think there's a room for that.
Cole, can I ask one final question?
Of course.
My lyric class, where you mentioned the sonnets, the writer of the sonnets, if it's Shakespeare, the poet writing the sonnets, is obsessed with beauty.
Yes.
And the fair youth. What's your take on the relationship in that sonnet sequence?
So first of all, I always tell my students, never read a sonnet at your wedding. The sonnets are meant to be read as a whole, and if you read them as a whole, they're about a very emotionally troubled person who's in love. As far as we can tell, it's a bisexual relationship with a young man and then a woman, and he can't make up his mind how he feels about them. And so I think there's incredible beauty in the sonnets, but I think the sonnets are also an exploration of aesthetic skepticism. And the speaker is trying to wrestle with his relationship with beauty. That sometimes he wakes up, he loves the dark lady, sometimes he hates her, sometimes she's wonderful, sometimes she's the worst thing that's ever happened to him. Sometimes he loves the fair youth and sees him as this, the best thing in his life. But sometimes he objectifies him and he treats him as if he's just a topic for his poetry. I love Sonnet 18 where he says, he's talking about the fair youth's beauty, but he never actually says anything meaningful about the youth. He just talks about his own poetry and what he's going to do with his own poetry. And so there's a lot of narcissism there. And I think I've always wanted to teach a class called Augustine and Freud Read the Sonnets, where we read Augustine and Freud's view of sexuality, and then we would look at how those ideas are worked out in the sonnets. Because I always tell my students, sonnets are ways of navigating problems, hopefully finding resolution. And I think all of the sonnets collectively are trying to work out the speaker's obsessive desires, which I think oftentimes he is actually aware of, are obsessive.
Very good. Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Dr. Jeffrey.
Thank you.